Thanks everybody for coming. Today we're going to talk about religious prehistory. I know I promised last time we'd start with Egypt, but it occurred to me I probably should do this first. So let's do it. This will take us right up to Egypt and get us into Egypt, and the last slide here will be an introduction to Egypt, and then we can dump right into that next class. Go ahead, David. Do you know how to turn off the lights over there and at least turn down the light that's right here? One of those buttons over there, so on the right side of the door, there's a bunch of buttons that control the lights. One of them will turn these lights off right at the front so the slides show up better. Ones though, but you can trial and error and turn down lights until. Well, let's see. We want these lights off though. If we can get it, there we go. Perfect. All right, thank you. Religious prehistory. So before I do religious, so let's start with that. Prehistory is because it doesn't make this, the word itself doesn't make sense. I mean, there's no such, if history is the study of things in the past, there's no such thing as before the past. Prehistory just means, in this case, the past before the written word. Because history really begins when people can tell us in their own words what they think. And before the written word, we don't have that. So prehistory is the study of history before writing. And history before writing is really, really hard. Once you get writing, this is the pyramid text from Egypt. It's the oldest corpus, large corpus of religious texts that we have. And once you get to that, you can sit down, you can read it, and you can say, this is what they believe, this is what they thought, because they told us in their own words. Before that, what do? Well, you've got archaeology, so you can look at the things that they left behind. You can't look at the words they left behind, just the things. So you've got stone axes or clay pots. You can also use geology and climate science to try to figure out what their life might have been like given the environment they were in. Biology matters, sociology, molecular biology especially has played a role recently because DNA lets you trace their ancestry back through time and kind of figure out where they migrated to and who's related to who and where they came from. You can use sociobiology, which I'll discuss more, and you can also use modern prehistoric comparisons. And prehistory ends not at any one period in time, it ends in different periods of time in different places because writing impacted different cultures at different times. In fact, there were prehistoric civilizations living right next to us until just a few years ago. And in fact, you could argue possibly still today when some places still have illiteracy. So there were prehistoric cultures that existed alongside historic cultures. And sometimes the historic cultures would write about the prehistoric cultures. You can use that. And you can use also, you can go to places where prehistoric civilizations live today, and you can look at what their civilization is like, and then you can project. And that's obviously, you're going to make mistakes when you do that, right? Because one prehistoric civilization might not be like another and assume it's going to be just the same. This prehistoric civilization from 3000 BC is going to be the same as this one 50s AD is probably not accurate, but you can get some ideas from that. Are written outside descriptions. Land of prehistory. We're entering the land of theory and speculation. One of these, or see a lecture of somebody talking about ancient history, especially prehistory or the evolution of mankind or any of that stuff from 50 years ago. And we make fun of them because they're clearly wrong about almost everything. And what that means, though, is that someone 50 years from now watching my lecture is probably going to laugh at me. Because I'm probably going to be wrong. The difference is I'm going to admit up front that I'm probably wrong. And so what I'm telling you today is probably wrong. There's probably a lot of stuff in it that's wrong, but it's our best guess. And I want to also specify that I don't think there's anything wrong with guessing. There was nothing wrong with the fact that 50 years ago, we had people guessing about what was going on, and they were wrong because their guesses provided the hypotheses that were then tested, and then it was shown that they were wrong. So there's nothing wrong with speculation so long as you admit up front that's what you're doing, and you're open to new theories when new evidence arises that might overturn what you're guessing about. A lot of guessing today, more than normal, and I think that's okay, and it's par for what I'm discussing. And we just have to be okay with a little bit of uncertainty and possibly being wrong. All right, so I'm going to talk about prehistory in several stages. I'm going to talk about the evolution of humankind. So that means I've got about 2 million years to cover in about 30, 40 minutes, right? Then I'm going to talk about hunter-gatherers, and of course those overlap because mankind was evolving as a hunter-gatherer. The development of agriculture among modern humans, then city-states, and finally writing, which will lead us up to the next lecture, which will be Egypt. Of course, my goal, though, isn't to describe prehistory. There's a lot of lectures on the history of mankind and the evolution of mankind in prehistory. I want to talk about religion, how these things, what they believed back then is interesting. What religious practices they had back then is interesting. But even more interesting is how those things impact our religion today. So what does our evolutionary history inform us about why we do certain things in our religious traditions today? So let's start with human evolution. Speaking of being wrong, right? The early version of human evolution looked something like this. We had chimps and we evolved from chimps. And of course, that's not right. We evolved from common ancestors with chimpanzees and other primates. Those early primates looked a lot more like chimps than they did like us. Evolved since that time, just like we have. So it's not a line like this, it's more of a branching tree. The other thing that's wrong about this, it comes from, this is the sort of view of it that actually is wrong. When you make it more specific like this, you've got Australopithecus, then you've got Homo habilis, which is the first of the species we have. It's the first one that people tend to classify as Homo, meaning human. So that's our first human ancestor. Then we got Homo erectus, then Homo neanderthalis, and then Homo sapiens sapiens. That's us. And so that gives you the idea that we evolved from Neanderthals, and Neanderthals evolved from Homo erectus, and Homo erectus evolved from Homo habilis in a kind of a straight line. That's not what happened. And frankly, we didn't know that. When the first Neanderthal skulls were found, we thought we were looking at human ancestors. The reason we weren't is because the actual evolutionary tree looks something more like this. You've got Homo erectus, and somewhere Homo heidelbergensis branches from Homo erectus, and then branches into the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens, and the Homo sapiens are living at the same time as the Neanderthals. Instead of evolving from them, they're living at the same time, both evolving from earlier ancestors, and probably both living at the same time as Homo erectus. So it's a much more complicated view, and of course it's going to get even worse when we put the rest of what we know on here. And there's all these missing holes. You notice these dotted lines. We don't know. This is the other fun joke. We found all these, I would call them the missing links. We found all these different intermediate species that are halfway between these others. It's exciting, and it really validates evolutionary theory. Of course, to a creationist, every time you find a new missing link, you create two new missing links on either side, right? So we still have all these dotted lines and we don't know where they go, but it's still impressive what we have, and that we can do this. The other thing that people like to debate is Homo habilis really the first Homo, not a Australopithecus? And the reason people debate about that is because it's an intermediary form, meaning it's between, which is again what you would expect from evolution. Now, this is one view, and this is, again, wrong, because enter new evidence, and we now know, for example, that the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred. Now, just a few years ago, there was genetic evidence. They had sequenced the Neanderthal DNA, and they looked at the chromosomal makeup, and they said, look, if humans and Neanderthals interbreed, they're going to be, the child is going to be sterile, much like a horse and a donkey interbreeding. And so the conclusion was humans and Neanderthals didn't interbreed. It would have been impossible. And so there was no interbreeding going on, and the Neanderthals went extinct, and we wiped them out. Probably. This the theory went. Turns out that we were probably better adapted to the changing climate. We may not have just wiped them out, violently, but we also found Neanderthal DNA, certain sequences that we're sure came from the Neanderthals in our DNA, especially in Europe. where the Neanderthals lived. And so it turns out most of us in here, European, will probably have some Neanderthal blood in our veins and probably some Neanderthal genes in our veins. And the Neanderthals they went extinct. There's two types of extinction. This is kind of an interesting point. Every species goes extinct. We will go extinct. Everybody goes extinct. But there's two ways you can go extinct. You can go extinct and leave no ancestors, or you can evolve into something else, leaving ancestors behind. The Neanderthals went extinct that second way, because there are still Neanderthals alive today, or descendants of Neanderthals, us, at least some of us. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Actually, everybody except people whose ancestors come solely from sub-Saharan Africa has something on the order of 5% Neanderthal genes.
Yeah, the contribution is actually fairly high.
I mean, they must have, presumably they interbred in the Middle East, because it's all the East Asians, all the South Asians, American Indians, Australian Aborigines. The only people who don't have it are the people from sub-Saharan Africa.
And I believe there's also more Neanderthal DNA in Europe, especially because they seem to have interbred more than once, which is interesting.
And they're also descendants of.
Yes, and then there's other species that aren't even listed on here that we seem to believe we interbred with. So the point is, this is a more complicated story than we thought. And that's my point. There's probably a lot of that's going on. In fact, one of the things we found is that down one line, we think we found an ancestor because it has a human-looking, a modern human-looking foot. Down this other line, we think we found a human ancestor because it has a modern human-looking jawbone, and this one has a modern human-looking hand. The problem is, each of these has a different piece of the human puzzle. Which one are we descended from? And one of the ways to explain this is different human features evolved down different lines, and then they interbred to create the mosaic of us later, which is probably a more likely scenario, but we just don't know. Okay, again, that's interesting, but I want to talk about religion. So how do you get from evolution to religion? Well, one of the ways you do it is with sociobiology. This is E.O. Wilson. He's the real Ant-Man. I don't know if you've ever seen the Marvel movie about the Ant-Man. This is the real Ant-Man. He's the guy that went and studied ants. And he was very interested in why ants cooperate. How can cooperation evolve among ants? And he studied thousands and thousands of species of ants. He's the Ant-Man. You probably will see him on Discovery Channel or something if you watch one of those things. But he also coined a book called Sociobiology, and he got an awful lot of flack. Especially from very liberal circles, because what sociobiology says is that mankind isn't a blank slate and that much of our behavior can be explained by evolutionary pressures in our past. Because he'd spent forever finding how evolutionary pressures explained ant behavior, and he thought it would be stupid to claim that humans aren't a product of their evolutionary history and past. That made a lot of people very unhappy, because if mankind is a blank slate, then all you have to do is change culture, and ta-da, racism will vanish. Gender inequalities will vanish. We just have to fix our culture. But if we're a product of our genetic heritage, some of this might have a lot more to do with human history or human nature than we think. And that's an uncomfortable idea, because if for example, racism is a product of human nature, it's going to be much harder to overcome. It's also possible to take some of what E.O. Wilson said and turn it into sort of a Nazi-like racial supremacy. After all, if we're a product of our DNA and our evolution, then maybe some species are better than others. Some subspecies of humans are better than others, is the way they would phrase that. And you can become a very powerful racist. E.O. Wilson wasn't a racist, but he got booed off the stage by people claiming he was often. It turns out he was almost certainly correct from a scientific perspective in his view of how all this worked. He's been vindicated over and over again since this time. And his point, and I think mine, is that just because an idea can be used by a racist to justify racism doesn't mean that it has to be. In other words, it's possible to hold this view and be not a racist, as he was, and to say something, to take it a completely different direction. And there's scientific truth is what it is. Whether we choose to be immoral based on a given scientific truth is a choice we make that is perhaps separate from the realm of the scientific truth. So sociobiology says our behavior is a product of our evolutionary past. And so what we want to do, if we want to apply a sociobiological explanation to religion, we'll look at how we evolved, and we'll ask questions like, how did this product of our evolution lead us to behave in this way religiously? So that's kind of what I want to do in following stages. We've got the evolution of humans, which we've covered. Then we'll talk about hunter-gatherers, agriculture, city-states, and writing. So now we're on to hunter-gatherers. So it's a proud and we think of it as a primitive way of life, and we shouldn't. It's a proud and reasonable way to live on the land, and it's not an extinct way. There are hunter-gatherers still living in different places of the world. Not everyone is a farmer. But the idea of a hunter-gatherer is you hunt game to get your meat, and you gather the food that grows naturally. You don't farm the food that grows naturally, and you don't raise domesticated animals. So it's non-domesticated production of food from the plants that already are there and the animals that are already there by hunting and gathering what is around without direct cultivation. So our very earliest hunter-gatherers had certain evolutionary pressures placed upon them. For example, and see nothing, you just might die and go extinct. If you look at this picture and you see that there is a predator in the grass, which there is, I think, then you're much more likely to survive. And by the way, if you're wrong about the predator being there, it probably won't hurt your survival. If you're wrong, if you're wrong thinking there's one there when there isn't, that won't hurt your survival. But if you're wrong thinking there's not one there when there is, you're probably going to die and you won't pass your genes on to the next generation. This puts certain evolutionary pressures on our ability to see patterns in noise, right? So this is the way Michael Shermer, who's an outspoken atheist and opponent of religion, he sees this as evidence that religion is all kind of hogwash, which I don't agree with. But the way he describes this explains this idea pretty well. It says, if you believe that the rustle in the grass is a dangerous predator, then it is just the wind, a type 1 error. You're more likely to survive than if you believe that the rustle in the grass is just the wind, when it is a dangerous predator, a type 2 error. Because the cost of making the type 1 error is less than the cost of making a type 2 error, and because there is no time for careful deliberation between patternicities in the split-second world of predator-prey interactions, natural selection would have favored those animals most likely to assume that all patterns are real. Thus, we have famous ink blot tests that psychologists used to like to use. Now we don't think they really mean as much as we thought, but you show you a picture and say, what do you see? And the guy says, I see my mother. And he says, tell me about your mother, right? But frankly, I look at this and I see angelfish and I see a little bacteria, and we see patterns in what is otherwise noise. And I deal with this at work all the time. One of the things I work on is finding data patterns in image data. And that image data is noisy. And it's really easy to make stuff up, to see patterns in noise, because humans do that. That's just what it means to be a human, is we see patterns where no patterns really exist. Sometimes we see patterns in noise that are nonsense. And we think we're seeing something we don't. Shermer's religious argument, then, is that we think that there is purpose, sometimes, in the random events of our lives. We see patterns in them, sometimes that don't exist. And we see intent in things around us, and we see meaning in places where it's not always there. And there's an evolutionary reason why we do that. And it leads us to believe in spirits, deities, gods, and other things that aren't real. Bigfoot, truthers, birthers, people who think that our government blew up the World Trade Center. All these sorts of conspiracy theories, to one degree or another, suffer from this predilection to see patterns in noise when nothing is there. But he argues that that's also one of the reasons for religion, that we have religion. Now, this is something that our very earliest ancestors would have had, long before Homo. Back when our chimps do this too, humans do this. It's something part of all of our evolutionary past. So starting kind of at the back, the things we have in our evolutionary history that we really share with most mammals. Another one would be this idea of disgust, beauty and disgust, right? So the image on the left is beautiful. Why is it beautiful? I mean, that's an interesting philosophical question. Where does beauty come from? But a sociobiological answer is that the left is beautiful because if we find certain environments beautiful, we're more likely to settle in them than environments we find ugly. And it just so happens that the environments we find beautiful are also the ones that are most likely to keep us alive. If we live there, you can actually take this and scale things on a how easy is it to live there scale, and then show a bunch of pictures of those places to people and ask them how beautiful they are, and they match. So there's something going on in our evolutionary past that makes one image beautiful and the other one disgusting. Now, why is it that a piece of rotten meat would look disgusting to us? Right, so there's an evolutionary pressure there that says, if you eat this, it'll make you sick, so I'm going to make you disgusted by it. And go ahead, David.
Except Europeans 1,000 years ago, if they looked at that picture on the left, they wouldn't have called it beautiful. Not cultivated.
so yeah.
They thought of anything, that was wild. They would never call it beautiful.
But they probably would have been afraid of it because it's wild and
yeah.
And those other mechanisms push at us. So this is Jonathan Haidt's view of one of the origins of religion, and that is that this idea of awe, beauty, and disgust were created by evolution for one purpose and kind of hijacked for another, and that is we also use them for our moral sensibilities. There's the same feeling that makes us disgusted at a piece of rotten meat makes us disgusted when someone does something immoral, or that we consider immoral. We become disgusted by their behavior. And those emotions were built by evolution for one purpose, and they've been hijacked for another purpose, which is to help us live in society. These moral codes also have evolutionary purpose, which we'll talk about, and including our disgust at behavior will then have an evolutionary root. And this then forms the root of some of our other religious prohibitions, right? Thou shalt not do this because that is disgusting. And there's an evolutionary pattern to that. Now, there's certain things that we do when we encounter something that is disgusting, namely we wash. We like to wash and get clean. Why do we do that? Well, there's an evolutionary reason for that too. We didn't understand bugs, but we did understand that if you touch something that was contaminated, disgusting, it picked up that contamination even if you couldn't see it on it. That's why if I were to walk in here and say something like, this is the hoodie the Unabomber wore when he murdered all those people, most of you wouldn't even want to touch it. But there's no germs on it, right? But if we had an evolutionary predilection that things that were disgusting and touch other things that are disgusting are then disgusting, you're more likely to survive because you're less likely to pick up on germs. And even better, if you wash your hands after touching something disgusting, you're more likely to survive. And so washing and sacred places like oases became sacred places, and water washing became common religious rituals to remove the other kind of disgust. Disgust over behavior, guilt over actions. This is out, damned spot from Hamlet, or not Hamlet, it's from Macbeth. Out, damned spot. Why is she washing her hands? She's trying to remove the disgust she feels over her own behavior with an evolutionary method that is built into human nature to get rid of touching disgusting things that would help you survive, that has been reappropriated for a different purpose. So you see washing as a central part of religious rituals across the globe, like this Islamic, they're preparing to wash before they go and they worship, and you also have, here's the Pope washing immigrants' feet to try to show solidarity with the immigrant population. And again, this concept of washing has become an ingrained religious ritual because of evolutionary origins. This may also have something to do with the Israelite code of clean and unclean. Notice how it borrows that cleanliness language, clean and unclean, foods that you can eat, clothes that you can wear, etc. All right, so the other thing that happened in human evolution, and this is, again, I'm going from the older to the newer, is we started making tools. My guess is we got this idea of disgust down and long before, but then we started making tools. What's interesting about the tools, and I'll say this many times, is bones evolved faster than tools for millions of years. But on the left is the most common stone tool. What it is just a rock, and they flaked it this way and flaked it that way to give it a sharp corner, but the back part of the rock has not been touched at all, and you use it to cut stuff. And it fits in your hand. And that same tool was made by the same people for millions of years, or by different people. They would evolve from one species to another, they'd make the same tool. In general, we used to think that tool making was the central aspect of what made us human. We made tools, chimps didn't. And when people started making tools, we started calling them Homo habilis, etc., the handyman, because he made nicer tools than Australopithecus that came before him. Tool making was what was inherently human. We no longer believe that to quite that same extent, but we'll talk about that in a bit. From this, I believe, we gained this idea that physical objects have power to do stuff, right? And I can take this stone, I can shape it, and now it has the power to cut things. On the right is an amulet from ancient Egypt. And you'll notice kind of the same psychological thought process. I take something, I shape it in a certain way, maybe say the right words over it, and it has the power to do something. Only the one on the right does something spiritual, while the one on the left does something physical. Or I guess that divide isn't quite as perfect because the Egyptians wanted something physical out of their spirituality. But it's an amulet. It's supposed to have magical properties that affect the world around you. And before we make too much fun of that idea, it's true that physical things can affect the world around you, not just physically, but spiritually, because of the mental impact they have. How many of you have a beautiful piece of art on your wall? Because that piece of art is a physical object that has some sort of mental impact on your reality because it's there. If you have an amulet like this that creates a certain thought process, well, it changes your thoughts and thereby changes the world. In fact, you could call it a placebo. And I don't use the word placebo in a negative sense. Placebos are incredibly powerful things. In fact, it's so hard for medicine to work better than placebos, not because most medicines don't work, but because placebos work so darn well. If you give somebody a placebo, they get better. Depending on the disease, a lot of things they will get better. And so these physical objects had meaning to the people, and they became powerful placebos. So again, one of the things we see from earliest religious traditions and times is this sort of toolkit that isn't designed to cut things, but is instead designed to have an impact on your mental state that gets assigned religious value. Amulets, etc., or even idols. When you start building idols, they all kind of evolve from the same sort of mental process. Okay, the miracle of human speech. At some point, probably after we started making tools, and I say that because we can actually teach chimps to make tools. We've taught orangutans to make stone tools. Orangutans can actually make some of the stone tools our ancestors did. They don't do it naturally, but if we teach them, they can do it and they can use them. Some of these really early ancestors seem to use, and chimps use tools. They don't use stone tools, but they use sticks, etc., to poke it. And they will shape the stick to the right shape, and they'll sharpen the end and then stick it in a termite mound. The termites will bite the stick, they'll pull it out and then chew the termites off the stick. They're using a tool. So again, tools used to be what made humans unique. Now we're not so sure, because other animals use tools. In fact, a bird makes a nest. That's a tool, dang it. So lots of animals use tools. Human speech, communication is also not unique. Dogs communicate with each other in a pack. They do it by raising their hackles, growling, wagging their tails. But human speech is on a different scale, just like human tool making is on a different scale. In other words, it's a matter of scale more than it is of kind. And human speech is another one of those miracles that really sets us apart. And we don't know when it happened. In other words, did Homo erectus speak? Well, the parts of the brain involved in interpreting speech left an imprint on their skulls. They were large and of the right size, so maybe. But their larynx wasn't as developed and dropped to the same place as ours, which means it would have been harder to make certain sounds. So somewhere between Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo sapiens, we learned to speak. I mean, really speak. Whether the Neanderthals could do it, we don't know. That's another open question. Turns out they have the gene, the FOX, whatever it is, gene that is related to human speech understanding. So maybe. But I want you to take, we are so used to talking, we don't understand what a miracle it is. So I want to back off for just a minute. I have an idea. What is that idea? Neurons in my brain are firing in a certain pattern. And it's an idea. Cats are cute. So somehow that pattern in my brain of firing neurons gets translated into another set of firing neurons that move my mouth and move my larynx, and I make these sounds. Cats are cute. Those sounds travel through the air and they hit your ear. All right? And the ear sends neural patterns into your brain, and your brain forms an idea. And the goal is for the idea in my brain to be the same as the idea in your brain. But the word cats are cute does not contain everything in the idea. The only reason I can put my idea into your head is because we have a shared understanding of what a cat is, what cute is, and that cats really might be cute because we have a shared concept of cuteness from our evolutionary past. So cats are cute. Now you've got an idea in your head that is hopefully the same as the idea in my head, or at least similar. This particular cat isn't terribly cute to me, but my idea maybe didn't translate correctly. And that's why we have so many arguments with our spouse and with our, our friends and our neighbors, because when we talk, we don't do a very good job of expressing ourselves. But this is a really hard problem, and it's amazing that it works at all, and that somehow evolution created a tool to help us do this magic thing, which is akin to mind reading, is nuts. Right? And so I really want it to sink in what a big deal this is. This is huge. And it has all sorts of religious implications. Let me read to you a section from the Book of the Dead. The words for being transformed into a lotus. I don't know why they want to be a lotus in the next life, but, O lotus belonging to the semblance of Nefertum, I am the man. I know your name. I know your names. You gods, you lords of the realm of the dead. Egyptian Book of the Dead, 81b. And frankly, when I was preparing for this class, I opened my Book of the Dead randomly and picked the first one I found. Literally, this is the first one I opened to. And it was like, this is perfect. Why? Because they're all like that. What are they expressing? On the left here is Isis. She is called the goddess of magic. And the reason she's the goddess of magic is because she's the one who knows the names. That's what she's called. She who knows the names. Something about a name. Now, I want you to understand, every word is a name. Cat is a name. It's a symbol. Names are symbols. So we're talking about symbolism here. Names are symbols. What we're doing is taking ideas, creating symbols that compress those ideas, transmitting them, and then decompressing them on the other side of this noisy channel. We're talking about symbolism. And what the Egyptians are expressing is the concept that there is power in the symbols, not just to communicate ideas, but to shape reality itself. So this is from the Hebrew Bible. And God said, let there be light. And to say it is to do it is the primary operas modus of magic, the magic worldview of the ancients. To say it is to do it. We still do that today as Christians when we pray. To say it, in some extent, is to do it and to make it happen. And of course, that leads us to symbolism that is more complicated than language, which is where we went with the tools. But now I hope we see it a little bit differently, right? Because this is another form of symbolism. Just like the words are symbols, now we've got other abstract symbols. And later we'll get to symbols that make sounds, right? But the ability to make symbols out of things is one of the hallmarks of humanity. And it gives us all sorts of power to understand the world and to manipulate the world and to communicate with each other. And it plays an important role in our religions. There's Isaiah loved symbolism. And when I would teach my Isaiah class, all my friends was like, why don't he just say what he wants to say? And why all this symbolism stuff? It's so confusing, And well, for them, the complexity was part of the beauty. And these symbols are beautiful, and they understood it. And by manipulating the symbols, they felt like they were manipulating the unseen world to some extent. Just like the amulets or symbols that therefore have an impact on the reality around them, just like the words do, just like the amulets do, just like all the other symbols do. And frankly, just like I said before, we shouldn't make too much fun of that. Right? Visualize the shot. You close your eye, you visualize the shot, and you'll do better at golf if you visualize the shot before you shoot it. And the same sort of thing. These symbols bring concepts to mind that then impact the way our mind is thinking about reality and the world around us, and that actually does impact the world around us. I think of these as mental technologies that we would abandon at our own loss. You know, if a certain symbol has a certain meaning for you and you can use it in your life to create certain mental states, you should do that. And to not do that is to lose something. You don't have to believe in the supernatural to see value in this sort of thing. In fact, if I'm going to admit something about myself, have you ever seen, there's all these books and they'll be like, you know, this gem has this healing property. You ever seen those? And they're nonsense, and most of them are just made up. But when I was a kid, I loved crystals. They were just beautiful things. And certain crystals would evoke certain emotions more than others. A red one would be, you know, passionate, and a blue one would be calming. And so I collected them because I thought they were beautiful. I was a rock hound. And at some point I started realizing, you know, when I'm in a bad mood, I go and get my blue one out and I feel better. And it's not because I believe in the supernatural, it's because those things convey those meanings to me, not because they have some inherent meaning in them. And so people noticed this. They didn't know where it was coming from, and they thought it was coming from something inherent in the rock, and out came these religious sort of attachments. So now we've got tools, we've got symbols, we've got speech, and at some point we started burying our dead. The Neanderthals did it first, and there's some debate about why they did it. Did they do it to get the body out of the way, because, to avoid rotting, to keep predators away, or did they do it because they actually had a belief in the afterlife? And we don't know. However, by the time of the Homo sapiens, 100,000 years ago, they were burying grave goods. And these grave goods are actually a copper arrowhead from much later. But we have grave goods from this far ago from the Homo sapiens. And so at this point, I think pretty much everyone agrees that some belief in life after death has taken hold. There's not a lot of other reasons you would put something valuable down a hole with a dead body. If there wasn't some sort of belief in life after death. So a belief in life after death is old and goes back to near the beginnings of Homo sapiens of development as a unique species. Our ancestors believed in it. It's not surprising that we do too. So I think what that means is at some point humans got to the point where they realized that their friends are going to die, that they're going to die, and they had to come up with some way of dealing with their own existential crisis because they're starting to see their own existential crisis. And a belief in life after death results and is incredibly common. The other thing that's special about us is we are cooperators. In fact, this has been put forward as a replacement for tools as the defining feature that makes humans different than our neighbors. Of course, our neighbors are social animals too. Right? I mean, you know, chimps live in social groups. Wolves live in packs. So social animals are not unique, but we have a sort of social interaction that allows a certain level of specialization and trade that takes us to the moon. I mean, literally, that's how we got there. It's not that people are smart enough to go to the moon. It's that one person is smart enough to make plastic, and one person is smart enough to make glass, and one person is smart enough to build silicon, and another person is smart enough to etch chips on the silicon, and another person is smart enough to build a computer out of that, and each one of us does a very small piece of this much more complicated puzzle. And we have the ability as a species to put all that together and do something with it. And that's a level of cooperation that none of these other animals have. Experiments have shown that chimps can cooperate. You know, if you put two ropes on a thing and you try to, if you pull on one of them, the rope just kind of pulls out. But if you pull on both of them at once, the tray will move towards them and you put little treats on the tray, and chimps will cooperate. But the environments in which they will cooperate, especially ones that involve like trading, that sort of thing they don't do very well. We do. And like I said, the difference between those two is the difference between being able to get some treats off a tray and going to the moon. Cooperation is really where it's at. Humans are super cooperative species. So where did the evolution of cooperation come from? Evolution is supposed to be selfish. The naive answer is, well, species who cooperate more survive better, so cooperation is favored. All right, that's the naive answer to the problem. It turns out it's not that simple because cooperation is unstable. It's very unstable because we have what we call the free rider problem, where I get in a group of other people who cooperate, but I don't. I just take advantage of them, and they cooperate with me, but I don't cooperate back. And I get all the evolutionary advantage of cooperation with none of the costs, and I free ride. Free riding is the ultimate enemy of cooperation in an evolutionary sense. Because if I have a gene that makes me cooperate and you have a gene that doesn't, and I cooperate with you and you don't cooperate with me, your gene will survive and mine won't. And the genes for cooperation will die out of the species. Evolution has solved this problem many times. The best way it solves it is kin selection. That's why the ants that E.O. Wilson studied are the best cooperators on the planet. And the reason for that is because they are all clones. They all have exactly identical DNA, and evolution does not care whether I survive or not. It cares whether my DNA survives. And so if I can help my sister survive, she will reproduce my DNA just as well as if I reproduce. And so ants are these super cooperative species because of what we call kin selection. Kin selection works in wolves as well. So wolves don't have identical, they're not, clones is the wrong word, but they're not sisters the way all these ants are.
The ants are identical, but they're more closely related to their mother than they would be to their own children.
Offspring, that's right.
Yeah, because of the oddities of their chromosomes.
Well, yeah, and because their mother, they're all sisters.
No, it's not the difference.
Yes.
It has to do with how chromosomes work in that group.
Okay. So in a wolf pack, almost everyone is also related. This is true of prides of lions, etc. They're all related. And so what happens is if I have a gene for cooperation, you probably do too. So helping you survive helps my gene for cooperation because you probably have it too. And that overcomes the free rider problem, kin selection. Now, humans cooperate with people that are not family members at all. So how did that happen? One of the best answers is kin selection happened first. We evolved in small tribes of closely related individuals, and we built the brain technique for cooperating with our kinship groups. And then we found ways to take people who are not members of our kinship and treat them as if they were. This is why we have brother, sister, Smith in many religious. You call each other brother and sister. They're bringing out that they're treating you like family. But how did we do that without the free rider problem taking over? Well, one of the ways you can solve the free rider problem is you can put everybody in the same canoe. And now it kind of turns out that if I tend to take advantage too much, maybe the canoe doesn't make it to the other shore and everyone dies, and now you kind of all want to pull. That's one way to do it. And by the way, forming hunter-gatherer groups that either succeed or fail in this hunt is one way to do that. But you still have a small desire to put in less effort than everyone else, but just enough to succeed, and let someone else kind of put in most of the effort. The other way it does it is in-group cooperation without group competition. In other words, you form a group, you rally around a flag of some sort, an idea, and by the way, a religion. The religion forms a new us. You compete with the thems in favor of the us's. And if you can fluidly form an us with a certain group, and then outcompete the other groups, the groups that have the ability to form that group and have the right group cohesion will survive, and the others won't. So these are all weak ways of dealing with the free rider problem, but I think they're prevalent in our behavior. This is why Republicans hate Democrats. Above and beyond policy. This is why religions hate each other and fight. One of the reasons, because we evolved to cooperate with our in-group and to fight with the out-group. We're not very good at cooperating with the out-group. And we label things and rally around ideas, groups, flags, religious beliefs. And usually we list that as a bad thing, and sports teams. Usually we list that as a bad thing, but frankly, the cooperation we have within our in-groups is part of what makes humans what we are and help us survive. And so we shouldn't, I think, feel too badly about it. What we have to learn is how to hijack, I believe, is to hijack our inherent natures to create a new in-group that includes everybody. Because we're really good at cooperating with our in-groups. Once we bring everybody into that in-group, we cooperate with them very well. We just need to understand where both our antagonism and our desire to get along come from and leverage it. So this is the strongest, though, and it's the least talked about, and I don't know why, but that's reputation. We kick people out of our groups who free ride. Have you noticed how humans do that? And so one of the ways we solve the free rider problem is we watch who cooperates, we watch who doesn't. The people who don't cooperate get a bad reputation, and then they have a hard time finding a group. And you know what happens when they have a hard time finding a group? They don't survive. And so what we've done is we've created selective pressures that reward cooperation and punish people who try to free ride. And if you don't have that gene that causes you to kind of carry reputation around with you, then you're a lot more likely to be taken advantage of and to not survive as well against the free riders among us. So there's gossip, there's loyalty, and there's leadership. And all those principles help us overcome the free rider problem, especially loyalty. Loyalty is something that probably evolved to make sure we didn't get a bad reputation. Because we don't want to be the ones with the bad reputation, because then we won't survive. So we are inherently loyal to our groups. Once you form a new group, your ideas will shift to match theirs. Almost imperceptibly, you'll just notice you start thinking like them, because thinking like them, and to the exclusion of evidence. This is one of the reasons religions have a hard time convincing people by evidence that maybe this religious belief is wrong. Because if you're in a group and they're your in-group and you're loyal to that group, if you're the sort of person who will counter that group's flag in the ground, their beliefs, you're probably going to get kicked from the group and your survival will be at stake. And so evolution cares more about keeping you in the right group than it does about making sure you're right about your beliefs. And so we didn't evolve to be right. We evolved to get along with our group. But reputation matters. And it's at least one good way to overcome the free rider problem, because now I can label people who cheat and make sure that they're not the ones I'm cooperating with. And I form these groups, these flexible groups we talked about before, among other people likely to be loyal to the group. And you see that in religion. Now, the other thing that happens is, Islam calls apostasy the most abhorrent sin. This wolf in sheep's clothing is from a Mormon meme. It's probably showed up in other places, but there's these passages in the Book of Mormon about how apostates are worse than people who never believed, because they knew the truth and left it, and they're the worst sort of people. There is something we inherently really don't like in terms of how we label each other's reputation for people who violate loyalty. Because if you're a member of our group, we want to be able to trust you to cooperate with you in this hunt. And if you betray us and go over to the other group, how can I ever trust you again? And so I'm unlikely to form a group with you a second time, because you're not trustworthy in that sense. And again, this plays a role in how religions treat those who then violate their more sacred tenets and leave or change religions, or etc. There's an inherent human backlash against that sort of behavior. Okay, so once we get there, I think we're forming a background that will help us later. The other thing that happened about the same time in human history is we started to revere certain places. And again, there's probably an evolutionary reason, right? That there's certain places that are good for us that we go to. But But certain places also gathered religious significance. Caves became doorways to another world, to the spiritual world. Mountains also. One, because it leads you to the netherworld, the mountains because it leads you to the heavens. It's a way to get close to God, to go to the top of the mountain. Wells, I've got Jacob's Well on the right there. That's one of my favorites. Springs. Again, there's probably evolutionary reasons for preferring these environments. But certainly certain environments gain sacred significance, partly from what happened or what supposedly happened in those places. We will associate certain sacred places with the creation of the world, with the place where God stood or where a sacred prophet stood, where Jacob walked. Those places will gain spiritual significance because of what happened there. Just like Einstein's pen would be interesting for everybody to see and touch, not because a pen is special, but because it's Einstein's pen, and he probably wrote E=mc² with this pen, and it seems to rub off on the pen, some sort of spiritual significance. That's, again, part of human nature. But similarly, certain places are bad for the same reason. Something horrible happened there, etc. And then finally, cultural evolution. At some point in our evolutionary history, and it happened just about when Homo sapiens split, this pace of cultural evolution began to outstrip biological evolution. So I've said this before, but now it's the core point. For most of human history, bones evolve faster than technology and culture. Same technology, same culture, and we are evolving into different subspecies because our bones are moving faster than our culture. At some point in the last 50 years, that's completely different. I mean, these people made the same stone tool for millions of years. We went from the iPhone, from this other cell phone to the iPhone. And that's because at some point in our history, cultural evolution began to speed up faster than biological evolution. And again, part of that is because of our ability to cooperate, our ability to specialize, and then our ability to trade. Part of it is also our predilection for teaching and learning. Chimps will watch each other and pick up things like the stick trick from watching their elders. But there's no indication that the elders sit down in a class and teach young chimps how to use a stick to pull mites. There's no teaching in that sense. We like to teach, and we like to learn, and you're in this class presumably because of that very reason. And so religions they send out missionaries. So again, this like concept of teaching was important to our cultural, our evolution as a species. It's one of the things that makes us special, but it's also something that evolution uses, or that religion uses. Can we teach? One way to think of religion, by the way, is as a meme. Just like genes evolve through genes, ideas can evolve. They're called memes. Religion isn't invented sometimes so much as it evolves. And the religions that survive are the ones that are well fitted for their environment, namely our minds, our culture, our place. And so they need things like immune systems to make sure they're not kicked out, like faith. Believe this, whether there's evidence or not, and that's faith, and that's good. So somehow you've almost enshrined belief without evidence as the ultimate good. The thing that saves you from sin and death is belief without evidence. And that prevents you from disbelieving the faith. But you also need to procreate. The faith is a meme, and it's trying to create a procreating body. And so it creates missionary religions, because missionary religions procreate better than non-missionary religions, and therefore they survive better and they're more likely to exist. One of the great debates in people who study religion is whether religion is a parasitic meme or a symbiotic meme. It lives with humanity as either a parasite or a symbiotic relationship. Sending us out on missions is the meme reproducing itself. At our expense, perhaps. Perhaps not. I learned an awful lot from my mission. I became a better person because of it, and better able to do all sorts of things like teach these classes or interact with people at work, because it taught me how to interact with lots of people. So is it a parasite or is it a symbiont? And that's one of the great debates. And I think the answer is yes. Because because each religion is its own little subspecies. And some of them are parasitic, and they convince you that God is coming on a comet and you all kill yourself, and that's a parasite. And it's such a virulent parasite that it killed its hosts and ceased to exist. There are viruses who do that, by the way. They kill their hosts so much that they drive themselves extinct, and that was Heaven's Gate. And there's other religions that benefit the people who follow those religions, and by benefiting those people, benefit themselves. Religion spreads because the people who have that religious belief do better, and then the religion spreads. And so there are religions whose reproduction is parasitic, and there are religions whose mode of survival and reproduction is symbiotic. And I think one of the things that I like about Unitarian Universalism is it's almost like we've sat down and kind of self-evaluated our own religion and said, we want to make our religion symbiotic. So we're going to cut out the bits of our religion that are parasitic, and we're going to keep the parts that are symbiotic, and we're going to build our own religious structure that's going to be symbiotic with us, almost on purpose from the ground up. And I like that. It's kind of fun. So cultural evolution. We got intentional teaching, specialization in trade, and specialization in trade will impact religions because it will create things like priesthood and chiefs and elders. It'll change leadership roles. And we'll improve tools, and we'll end up with things like art and agriculture and eventually writing. So let's talk about that art. The first art shows up with Homo sapiens. We get these wall caves, paintings on cave walls. And there's a lot of theories about what the purpose for the cave wall. I'm going to go back. These pictures are beautiful. I want you to just kind of see, especially the one on the right. There's a scene of a hunt on the left. The right is almost an artistic expression of a bison. I don't know exactly which animals we're dealing with even, but if you look at, I think it's a bull of some sort on the bottom. These are really impressive works of art created by our very distant ancestors. And there's a lot of debate about what they were for. One of the main theories is these were hunting. They painted the pictures of the animals they would hunt, and maybe they had religious significance because they would help them. They felt like they would help them get a good hunt. You paint a successful hunt, and then you go out and have a good hunt. Almost a placebo to make you a better hunter, right? And so they probably worked in that sense. But another theory is that they're shamanistic. And the word shamanistic is problematic because shamanistic, some cultural circles, just it's identical to primitive or silly or. Right? It's shamanistic. That means a primitive religion, shamanistic religion. But what shamanism usually means is you have a person who is capable of entering what they think is the spiritual world and who has certain ritual techniques for creating that entry. And then they come back and share with the people what they learned. That's what we mean by a shamanistic tradition. And frankly, Buddhism then is a shamanistic tradition almost by definition. The Buddha entered a state of special meditative trance, learned certain truths, and came back and told the world what he learned, and including the techniques for entering said trance, right? The meditative techniques. These meditative techniques often will involve beats, rhythms, sensory deprivation. And now we think about where these paintings are. They're in caves. It's a perfect place to have a sort of vision quest. They often will also use drugs, peyote, this sort of thing. And what it does is it engenders a certain ecstatic trance or mental state that is not being made up. These states are real, and if you've ever experienced anything like it, you kind of know what I'm talking about. They're crazy stuff, and you can have very profound experiences this way. And there's a lot of ways to create those experiences. And one of the theories of the cave paintings is that these were places they would go to have these experiences, and then they would paint on the walls representations of what they would see, either during the vision quest or after. Again, we don't know because there are no written records for what they were using these cave paintings for. The reason that the shamanistic hypothesis, by the way, comes from that technique of using modern hunter-gatherer societies to try to impose backwards, because we know that certain hunter-gatherer societies do this. They go into caves, the whole deal. They go into a cave, they have a vision quest, they paint on the wall what they're seeing. And so that's kind of being worked backwards is the source of that theory. But they didn't just paint on the caves. They did this stuff. And these are pre-agricultural. So when you look at those and we're like, oh, well, that's a fertility cult, we would expect it to be post-agricultural, but it's not. These are pre-agricultural. A lot of them are in stone. Some of them are in ivory. Some of them are in antler bone. They were very skilled carvers in these bones. And they look to us like they're not just artistic. These probably have fertility implications. So we may have the beginning of deity worship and even idols to represent the deities. And they're very, very old. Now, I want to put this in perspective. We've had written language for about 5,000 years, just over. So when you go back 40,000 years ago, that's, eight times. So we're really talking about both a long time ago and a short time ago. I mean, humans are starting to do this stuff 40,000 years ago, and we think, well, that's a long time ago. And then we think, well, gee, we've had writing for 5,000 years. That's a big chunk of human history since we started making stone tools, and we moved from there to the moon in 40,000 years. And for 5,000 of those years, we've had written history. Evolution is not done with us. And the last few years have been, I hope you recognize what it means to live in the time you live, the number of changes or that you've seen in your life is unlike anything that human history has ever seen. Anyway, so those are the stages of human prehistory. We've got to agriculture now, and I'm out of time. So let me go quickly through agriculture, and I had less to say about this anyway, but agriculture is this moment when humans stopped hunter-gathering and started settling down and planting crops. And you really think about what a religious experience this is. A plant grows up, it dies, you take parts of its dead corpse, you stick them in the ground, and a new plant comes up. So from the perspective of our ancestors, this was life from death. This was resurrection. And so we have the Eleusinian Mysteries in Greece, which is a mystery cult about life from death, based on the miracle of planting grain. We also have 1 Corinthians 15 in the Christian New Testament, which if you haven't read, you should go read it, where Paul goes off on this long tirade about planting crops. And they go into the ground, one body, and they rise a different body. And that's what the resurrection will be like. And he makes this whole analogy between the resurrection and planting crops. The miracle of agriculture, of planting, well, two things: sex and planting crops will become an obsession for most ancient cultures. Not because they were obsessed with sex so much as life. And the miracle of creating a new life, that was the greatest miracle of all. And it was related to the goal of eternal life that they wanted to find. They didn't, of course, realize that seeds were the same sort of thing as sexual reproduction. They didn't understand that it's the same miracle. But for them, there were two kind of main miracles. And so a lot of this early religious traditions will focus on these two things: death of the plant, planting of the seed, and the miracle of it coming back to life. In multiplication, there's more of it than there was before. And then this ability to create a child within another person that grows and comes out, and it's a new person. That was also, again, essential to them. They would connect the seasons then with birth, youth, old age, and death, and then rebirth. So not only does it happen in the way you plant the grains, but it happens each year. The world is reborn. Each day, the sun is born, dies, is born again, dies, and then the seasons, the whole world is born again through the seasons and dies. So you have small cycles and big cycles, and the cycles of the moon. And they saw the world as cyclical, and they saw time as cyclical, going through these cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. And they would connect that to their religious beliefs about things like reincarnation, etc. And again, they became obsessed with fertility as a religious principle, and we get the fertility cults, especially usually the fertility cults are female, not always. So there is this kind of new age almost pushed forward especially by feminists, and I understand why, because Judeo-Christian religion has been so male-centric. They want some female-centric religion, and so they kind of imply that all these fertility cults are, Mother Earth worship and they're not. They're all different. They're all distinct. They're different female goddesses that they're all worshiping. Some of them aren't even female. We have male fertility goddesses, but there is a large number. So the right, at least in half, there are a large number of female goddesses associated with fertility that were worshipped in the ancient world, and those kind of disappear with the Abrahamic tradition of this male god. In the past, it was both. You had male and female gods and goddesses as part of the polytheism. They were very tied to the skies, an astronomical phenomenon, because they lived out under the stars. They saw the stars a lot more than we did. They didn't have the same light pollution, and they lived under a much brighter looking sky. And they were very connected to the sky, and it mattered to them, because if you plant your crops at the wrong time, they die. If you plant your crops at the right time, they live. You have to know when to harvest, when the migrations are coming, and so you have to find ways of telling when these cycles are coming around again. And they noticed that certain astronomical phenomena, like where the sun would rise on the solstices, would mark these calendar times, which would then tell them when to plant. And so astrology today, you were born under a certain sign, so you have a certain, personality. That's a continuation of this view that what happens in the sky is a sign for what's happening in the world. And of course, that earlier version of this, at least, was correct. And they would use their visions of their observations of the sky to time things like their planting. And for them, it was a magical thing. When the star rises, that's when you plant. And the shaman happens to know that particular mystical secret. He could read the skies in a way no one else could and tell everyone when to plant. And then, of course, that evolves into modern astrology, which is less grounded in some sort of reality. But you notice the skies as signs for the times and the seasons. This shows up in biblical text as well. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years." The skies are for signs. And the sun and the moon and the stars are all put up there to mark sacred times. So you know when the festivals are. You know when Yom Kippur is. You know when you should plant, when you should harvest, etc. And this is a very old tradition. It's in the Hebrew Bible, but it's much older. It's in these other traditions as well. You find this everywhere you look, including the way they build their temples to help you line up the solstices and figure out when the stars are rising in the right places. That's one of the things we'll see when we start looking at some of these early temples. They'll have astronomical alignments designed to help you with this. The results of agriculture were not all positive. It moved from a movement lifestyle, a very mobile lifestyle, to a sedentary lifestyle. And we actually see in the skeletons of these people a reduction in health, a reduction in life expectancy, but a vast increase of population and a certain number of religious changes all come with the development of agriculture. It didn't make our lives better, but it helped us have a lot more food so that there were more of us. And so it outpaced these other life traditions. Of course, having a sedentary lifestyle, even if you worked on the farm, probably wasn't as healthy for you as running down game on the open plains. And that may be part of the reduced health, but a big part of it was that the variety of diet went down. You ate a single grain for the majority of your diet, and your diet became less varied. You still had a few animals you domesticated, and you had this grain, and you weren't hunting, gathering, and eating off the land everything you saw. And you also packed people into cities and towns, and they didn't understand sanitation, and diseases spread more rapidly. So life expectancy dropped, diseases spread more rapidly, and people's lives got worse, but there were more of them. And they out-survived people who didn't do this in the sense of as a species, not as individuals. So individual life got worse and the species got better, if that makes sense. Another important one is because you're sitting in the same place, you end up with land ownership. Because you're not moving across the land, you're owning the land. You have inheritance laws because your kids are going to own the land, the same land that you owned. And you suddenly have a need for government mediation to try to figure out disputes about who owns what and to keep track of who owns what, etc. And so our cultural government system became more complex. Our inheritance laws became complex because for the first time we had something to inherit, and land ownership became a big deal. And so all of this grows out of agriculture, from our government structures to our religious structures. And they're related. So one of the religious changes is ancestor worship. Now that doesn't mean we didn't worship ancestors before, but it becomes visible after the development of agriculture. So starting from third period onwards, some elites incorporated family chapels in a special wing of the house dedicated to ancestor worship. And the sophistication of these chapels ranged from simple inhumations with tools or dishes to include a feeding tube from the surface down to the crypt in order to facilitate regular feeding for the deceased. So they have a video of the afterlife, but they're starting to worship their ancestors as well. This is in Mesopotamia, at least. One of the really fascinating things that happens in Mesopotamia is the connection to the firstborn. The firstborn is the one who will inherit the property and who will be the priest for the family chapel during the next generation. And then his firstborn will be the priest. And the priest inherits the family chapel and takes care of all the ancestors. The other kid, and he's the firstborn. So there's a priesthood obligation to the firstborn. And the other children will then go off and have other jobs and maybe create new households with new inheritance structures. But the firstborn gets a double inheritance from the brothers. So the property is split. You split up the property, but you give a double inheritance to the firstborn because he has a double job. He has to take care of the family shrine. This is something that is picked up in the Bible with the biblical emphasis on the firstborn. But it comes from this earlier Mesopotamian tradition of the family shrine worship of the ancestors, and the firstborn as the priest. So the firstborn also will have priesthood duties in biblical tradition, and it comes from this Mesopotamian tradition. So now we've got to city-states. We've done agriculture, and I can do this, I think, in about 5 minutes, and then I'll let everyone go. I've taken too much time because it took me a while to start up with my technical difficulties. So here's a city-state. What happens is, as people become agricultural, they begin to generate more food than they need. That means you can specialize, because you don't all have to be cooking food. Some of you can be priests, some of you can be kings, some of you can be military, some of you can be builders, and you can specialize in building good buildings and doing good art, or being a carver, or whatever it is. And so the technology explodes, because now you have people who can specialize in these different things. And you can put a lot of people together because you can feed them for the first time. And so population centers grew from small tribes, small villages, to big cities, with walls and a military and a local deity. So what this does to religion is that each of these cities tends to have a patron god. So, the god of Babylon, you have the god of Israel, whose center is Jerusalem. You have another one in Asher, in Asherah. And you have another one, Assyria, actually what I meant, not Asher, but Aser in Assyria. Baal is the patron god of Babylon. So each city has its own patron god. And they're each politically separate and unique. Each one has its own politics, and each one will have a king, later we'll see. And then certain city-states started conquering other city-states. So we went from family tribes to cities to nations. And the nations happened when one city-state conquered another. When that happened, something happened to their religion, because you had each city-state with its own god. So what tended to happen is when I conquered you, it was because my god was better than your god. That means my god is the king of the gods, and your god is in his court. And so when I conquered your city, I wouldn't say your god doesn't exist. I would just kind of inherit your god, put him in my court, in my pantheon of gods, but my god would be king over your god, just like I'm king over you when I conquered your city. And so that created this milieu of polytheism. It probably had other origins, but at least one of the ways in which polytheism evolved is this way of city-states conquering other city-states and incorporating their god into their theology, with their god being the supreme. So you end up with polytheism tends to have a lot of supreme gods with a bunch of other minion gods under them, and the supreme god just happens to be the god of the capital of the nation that conquered the others. And so that will become something we'll start to see when we do when we get into historical religion. Of course, once you have a city-state, you need complex social structures, complex government, and laws. These laws started out before we have written traditions, but we can only see them after the religious traditions happen. So this is one of those examples where we take written records and we impose them backwards to try to guess what was going on before. This is the law code of Hammurabi. What we have is Hammurabi being given the law by God. So God is passing to Hammurabi in that picture on the top the right to be king, the right to rule, and the right to give laws. Below it then will be the text of the law. This law code can be compared to the law code of the Israelite law of Moses in very interesting and fascinating ways. Both the similarities and the differences are fascinating. But this is one of the first large written law codes we have. And it sort of shows what happens once you get together in a city-state. You need laws. The laws are both religious and secular. They saw no distinction between the two. That was also probably an earlier tradition that we would have seen in prehistoric times. Laws must be kept because they create a better society if you keep them, because God wills it. Because we're maintaining social order. The sun rises and sets because it follows laws. We follow laws, and if we keep the laws, society will keep running. There won't be famines, there won't be loss of crops, etc. We also started building monumental architecture once we had this surplus in farming. This is Stonehenge. This one is Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the first temples. It's in Turkey. It's beautiful. I would love to have a class just on Göbekli Tepe. But there is a temple-centric view of the ancient world that says that civilization arose because of sacred centers that became these sacred god places where the chief deity of the center of the city worked. And the city itself was formed around a sacred deity who had a sacred temple. And it was because of pilgrimage to the temple that the city itself was formed. And that we owe civilization to temples and temple building. It's this temple-centric view. I think that's only partly true, but it certainly plays a role. Yeah,
I think David. Göbekli Tepe is actually pre-agricultural.
It coincides with the development of agriculture, and I think there's some, in fact, argument that agriculture arose there as part of the worship at Göbekli Tepe.
Here, it's certainly the stuff I've been reading about. I'm not sure, I don't remember the name, but that's about the right time. Is that they find these what appear to be religious centers with monuments, carved monuments and stuff, very large ones, and they can't find any evidence of agriculture at that time in that area. And so they think that it was actually done by people who were not really agricultural.
So this is part of the temple-centric view, is that the temple could have created cities which could have then motivated agriculture. I mean, the hunter-gatherers know that if you plant a seed, it grows. I mean, they were very well aware of that. The question is whether they decided to cultivate and when they saw advantages in it. And maybe they see advantages in it when they're trying to stick near a sacred site. And so you could argue that the temple creates the desire for agriculture, or you could say that agriculture makes the temple and sedimentary life that makes building temples possible. My answer usually is yes. Right, because one makes the other, which makes the other, and they create a feedback loop. But truly large monumental architecture tends to require agriculture. But that doesn't mean early monumental architecture didn't happen before it. So obviously, whenever we do this, we oversimplify. And then it's interesting to bring up the quirks to the question. Göbekli Tepe is especially interesting because it's one of the ones that enters into this argument, because it seems to be right at the boundary of agriculture. And in fact, I think they found some of the earliest grains there that had the evolutionary adaptations that show that agriculture has played a role in them. But I think they came like halfway through the occupation of Göbekli Tepe, so that's really interesting. All right. So what happens once you have kings to your religion? Well, suddenly God becomes king of the heavens. And when you build temples for him, they tend to look like throne rooms. For example, this is a throne room from Hatzor, and this is a temple from Syria. And if you just kind of flip back and forth, you've got a porch with two pillars, a throne room in the back, and a courtyard in front. Well, here's a courtyard, a porch with two pillars, and a throne room in the back. So what you're doing when you build a design like this is you're saying God is king. My God is king. And he's even got a throne in the back. And so we get these thrones from the Ark of the Covenant of the Hebrews to these Mesopotamian cherub encrusted thrones for the king to sit on. It's the same idea. God is king. And so once you have earthly kings, then you change your religious view. And kingship gets tied up with God. Not only does God give the earthly kings the right to rule and the right to give laws, God himself is a heavenly king. And then once we get these city-states, we start to get writing. And the earliest writing, and there was some debate, is it Egypt or Mesopotamia? I think Mesopotamia is winning right now. But another discovery in Egypt, and it might change. But they keep leapfrogging. Right now, Mesopotamia seems to be winning. That's probably what's going to happen. Is Mesopotamia is going to win this race, which makes me feel bad because I'm an Egypt freak. But what Egypt has first, for certain, is the first large corpus of religious writings, where people sit down and tell us what they believe and why they believed it. And so even if they're writing first in Mesopotamia, which is this tablet is actually one of the first examples of writing from Mesopotamia. And what it is it's keeping track of goods. It's tracking ownership, which I said happens once you get a sedentary lifestyle. You have to keep track of ownership. Well, people would keep track of, I sold you this many sheep, and then they would, and I owe you this many, whatever. And then they give it to the priest, and the priest would keep track of it. And because they would then, if there was a dispute, the priest would bring out the tablet and say, see? And so writing develops in Mesopotamia to keep track of that sort of stuff. Writing develops in Egypt to write down religious texts. And so I'm going to start in Egypt. Now that we've covered the prehistory of religion, our next month class, we'll sit down in Egypt with this text, and we'll go through it and see what the earliest people who left us a record of their religion believed and why. So, thank you. See you next month.
Want to know why my ants are social?
Go ahead.
Okay, so that group of insects called Hymenoptera have a very weird genetic system where females are dipole. They have pairs of chromosomes. The males are haploid. They only have one chromosome in each haploid. They got activated chromosomes, females. And this is what determines the gender of an offspring. So, how does this work in terms of reproduction? Well, it turns out that males have only a mother. They have no father. Okay, the mother's chromosomes split, and then if she's going to produce a male offspring, each singular set of chromosomes becomes an egg, and that's the male. But what this means for the females is that full sisters who share both a father and a mother, half of their genes come from the father, and the father is only one set of genes to provide. So that set of genes is the same for all the full sisters. The other half of their genes are like ours are, half come from half are shared, because the mother has two of each, right? So what it means is that full sisters are more related to each other than they are, I said it wrong before, either their mother or their own children. So in terms of spreading their own genes, the workers are exploiting the queen. They're doing a better job of spreading their genes than she is, by helping her have offspring, than she is by having offspring. And that's why you find this sociality appearing in the Hymenoptera. I think it's like at least 11 different times separately. Because it's incredibly advantageous for the full sisters to work together to help their mother have more full sisters.
Interestingly enough, I think
it's bizarre, totally bizarre.
Well, it's also, evolution has solved this problem many times. And one of the ways it solved it is in our cells. Each cell in our body is like an ant in a hive. From each cell's perspective, it wants to spread its genes. So there's only a few cells in our body, our reproductive cells, that actually do the reproduction. But our other cells' purpose is to support those cells and make sure they successfully reproduce. And because our cells are essentially clones, they don't have to spread their own genes by dividing. They can spread their genes by helping us have children. When each individual cell begins to mutate, for instance, exposed to radiation or whatever, it may happen that one of those cells decides that it starts splitting. And now its DNA is different from the ones around it, and it's splitting. And hey, if I split, I'll survive in the body better than my neighbors, and I'll outcompete my local neighbors. And we have a name for that, that's cancer. Cancer is what happens when the free rider or competition thing overrides our cooperation desire within our body. Because each cell, frankly, is a separate organism. So we went from separate single-cell organisms to multi-celled organisms specifically by solving the free rider problem, and we didn't solve it perfectly. That's why we did cancer. So, but it's the same sort of thing, and that's why a lot of people call ants superorganisms, because they're very much like individual cells, each reproducing with the reproduction organ of the entire superspecies in between. It's like we have our own reproductive organ and all our other cells. So this is kind of a theme that pops up in evolution. Okay, I'll see you all next month.
One thing about this question of sex and plant growth.
Okay.
I think they knew very early on that these things were similar and the same.
My mouse is not